Apple is going to change its CEO, so that's not surprising. It's more about the timing. After Steve Jobs and Tim Cook, it's John Ternus who will take over as head of Apple in September 2026. The king is dead, long live the king. It's true that a change of CEO at Apple is quite a significant event. The personality of its leader often has a big influence on the direction of the products. John Ternus, we don't know him very well. He's an extremely discreet person who will suddenly find himself in the spotlight and who will have to shoulder a company that is now valued at $4 trillion. So you might think it's cool to become the boss of such a rich, successful company. It must be easy. And yet the challenges awaiting John Ternus are huge. First, he has to succeed two legendary figures. Steve Jobs, the creative visionary, Tim Cook, the logistics genius who turned Apple into a money-making machine. Next, Apple is doing very well financially, but not everything is perfect. Apple is less inspiring than before. And there's also the danger that Apple could gradually become a bit outdated. And that doesn't cause a problem for sales right away, but it does create immediate problems in terms of image and recruitment. And then Apple is starting to fall behind in certain areas of technology. Of course, artificial intelligence. Apple Intelligence hasn't proven itself at all so far, but there's something even more serious than that. Apple users are starting to become dissatisfied. They're no longer finding the reliability, especially in software, that they used to have. There are more and more bugs and hiccups, especially on iOS. And this loss of reliability, which built Apple's entire reputation, the perfect marriage between hardware and software, if that starts to falter, it could be very damaging in the long run. So John Ternus's mission is going to be very difficult. How can you make people dream about Apple again? How can you bring in a whole new generation of Apple fanboys without killing the cash cow? He is a pragmatic engineer, but does he have a plan? And above all, does he have a chance to succeed? At Apple, change is happening now. As I told you, the surprise isn't so much the change of CEO. We expected that, but really it's the timing of this change. Most analysts expected a few more years of Tim Cook, but it's not entirely impossible that there's a bit of panic at Apple. First of all, lately, a lot of important figures in the organization have left Apple, some to retire, but many to join competitors, and Apple shareholders are getting more and more nervous. There's also this lag in artificial intelligence at a time when massive investments are being made. So who is John Ternus? Beyond a potential pun like I've Ternus, a chew and all that. He's 50 years old and has a degree in mechanical engineering. He joined Apple in 2001 directly in product design. Quietly, he climbed every rung of the ladder one by one. In 2013, he became Vice President of Hardware Engineering, and in 2021, he reached the pinnacle by taking charge of all hardware at Apple. What are his achievements at Apple? His biggest achievement is probably Apple Silicon. He played a very important role in that team. It's kind of his masterpiece. The Apple Silicon transition for Macs is still a very important and historic transition at Apple. And you'll see that it has a lot of significance for what comes next. He also oversaw the entire development of the iPad Pro and then the whole iPad Pro lineup. I mention this because it's one of my favorite products at Apple. And as for the iPhone, he basically came on board around the iPhone 12, so he worked on all the ones that came after. So you could say the return of industrial design, the flat edges and all that, that's kind of his doing. When I read a bit of his biography, two things stood out to me. He has an excellent reputation internally. He's someone who loves working in a team and is very good at it. And what people at Apple have also noticed is his truly pragmatic engineer side. And that probably had an influence, especially starting in 2021, on a kind of return to an engineering-driven approach at Apple. We were in very design-focused phases, with Jony Ive trying to remove all the connectors from the MacBook Pro, a bit obsessed with a minimalism that was certainly very aesthetic, but was really becoming impractical. We can assume that John Ternus has some influence in bringing back more pragmatic things. At some point, we need to plug in cables. But I think the main thing to remember about John Ternus is a very recent success. He's really the father of the MacBook Neo. He's the one who presented it. He even went to present it on American TV shows. You could say it's a pretty disruptive project at Apple. I had already analyzed it in a video, and it's probably something important to understand what's coming next. So, overall, we could be really happy to have an engineer, a real one, taking the reins at Apple. We're finally going to get some innovation. We're going to have new products that are solid. Yes, but there is a catch. If we look at the whole tech industry today, is the battle really at the hardware level? The current war, the big investments, it's all about software. I'm talking, of course, about artificial intelligence, generative AI. The investments in this field are enormous. And meanwhile, well, Apple, Siri, everyone kind of pokes fun at it. And now it's 2026 and Apple decides to appoint a chief engineer to lead Apple. Isn't that a bit paradoxical? And by the way, we might wonder why they didn't appoint Craig Federighi, the head of software, as CEO. Craig, everyone loves him. He's Air Force One. He makes people laugh during the keynotes. He's a real showman. So, some people say he wasn't appointed because he's 10 years older than John Ternus, which puts him closer to retirement. But I think maybe it's not just a coincidence either. Apple isn't doing very well when it comes to software. And maybe it's a little bit Craig's fault. If you're a regular user of the Apple ecosystem, you've probably noticed that for the past 2 or 3 years, there have been a few more bugs than usual. We weren't used to this lack of reliability from Apple. I have real problems myself. For example, with autocomplete on my iPhone keyboard, even though I didn't have this problem before. Other hassles with things that should be super smooth, like AirDrop. In short, as updates go by, we end up with a big collection of bugs. And that's really not good for Apple's reputation. And of course, the elephant in the room, quick sponsored reminder, is that well-known lag in AI. So here too, I made a whole video about it, explaining why I think Apple is behind in artificial intelligence. Is it harmful or not? But the fact remains that we're in a time where everyone is more or less amazed by the results of Claude, Anthropic, ChatGPT, Gemini. And Apple Siri still hasn't stepped into the spotlight. So, which might make us say that the vice president in charge of software, Craig, might not be the right person for the future of Apple. And the fact that they appointed a very hardware-focused engineer to solve this problem might not be completely by chance either. Apple, their project for Apple Intelligence, isn't about making an AI like the others. Apple has an obsession, an artificial intelligence that will run locally on our smartphones, our Macs, our tablets, and so on. Apple presents this nicely by saying it's mainly about our security so that our data stays on our devices and doesn't go to the other side of the world to be analyzed. What Apple tells us less is that it's a very nice project in terms of cost. Apple hasn't gotten into this race to make massive investments at all, hundreds of billions of dollars basically. To sum up, Apple wants to make an artificial intelligence that doesn't cost them much. The problem is that a powerful artificial intelligence running locally is very hard to make for 2 reasons. First, a personal generative artificial intelligence needs a huge amount of personal information. Every time you use Gemini or a ChatGPT chat, you feed that artificial intelligence. The more personal data it has, the more efficient it will be. If Apple forbids itself from training too much on your personal data, well, they're already starting with a disadvantage. Actually, that's the big risk with local artificial intelligence, that it will always be less capable than an artificial intelligence running on big servers in the cloud. And if you've used Apple Intelligence a little bit today, you'll notice that's the problem. It looks like ChatGPT, but ChatGPT from 3 years ago. I'll take a concrete example that we often see, the magic eraser on photos. There have been a lot of demonstrations showing that magic erasers on Google and Samsung can actually reconstruct your face even if it's masked, and they do it really well. Whereas if you use the Apple Intelligence AI fill eraser, the results are disastrous. That's a trademark term. But yes, how do you think Google and Samsung managed to reconstruct your face? It's thanks to your data. If Apple keeps refusing to use your personal data, it will never be able to reconstruct your face. So that's one of the paradoxes of artificial intelligence today. We want our privacy to be protected. We don't want to feed these big artificial intelligences with our data. But on the other hand, we make fun of Apple's artificial intelligence, which is obviously much less capable. And that's the real challenge for John Ternus, how to make Apple Intelligence effective and convincing. And that's where the hardware engineering side is a real asset. And above all, the fact that John Ternus worked very closely on Apple Silicon. Apple Silicon, let me remind you, has a lot of neural processors on it. And that's the whole strategy of John Ternus and the hardware team at Apple, to make up for the software lag in artificial intelligence with hardware power. Instead of investing in huge servers overseas, they'll use the combined power of all the de tout le hardware. Apple hardware, probably using data that will be much more fragmented, much more anonymized, but where the hardware will make up for this issue, compensate for this handicap. And the real bonus beyond confidentiality is that it will allow Apple to offer nearly free AI. So of course, there will always be a part that still runs on servers. Apple made that clear, but the majority of the processing will happen on the devices you've already purchased. And it's a tremendous advantage for Apple if they succeed because other AI companies are struggling just to reach profitability. If Apple manages to make Apple Intelligence almost as good as the others, while making it completely free or nearly free, well, they have everything to gain. And it's in this context that we can break down what could be John Ternus's strategy. First, a real takeover by the engineers at Apple. The domination of designers or salespeople is over. By the way, that's no coincidence. Johnny Srouji, who was also very important in the development of Apple Silicon, will take over John Ternus's former position. Basically, we're really going to have a dream team of engineers. It's really the end of an era of form over function, design before usability, which was the cause of some rather mediocre products at Apple. Smartphones that overheated too much because they wanted them to be very, very thin, keyboards that looked nice but didn't work very well. Now, with engineers, we're almost guaranteed a return to pragmatic, efficient, powerful, repairable products. And what John Ternus did with the MacBook Neo is really interesting. It's purely an engineer's solution to a market problem. How do you bring into the Apple ecosystem a whole group of customers who can't afford Apple products but want a new Apple product and can't buy second-hand? Well, the MacBook Neo can be summed up by saying it's an iPad screen, an iPhone processor, and a Mac keyboard. It's a stroke of genius. It's strategic because it really puts competitors in a tough spot as they're currently struggling to make Windows PCs with the rising cost of components. It's a real headache, and above all, that's probably what interests me the most. It's an aggressive strategy. And it's been a long time since we've seen Apple go on the offensive. Apple had gotten us used to that Olympian calm. We're above the competition. We don't really get involved in what they're doing. Here, you can tell John Ternus wants to go straight after the entry-level market. What could his strategy be for the rest of the Mac lineup? It's hard to guess. There's a lot of talk about a touchscreen MacBook. If he does that, he's really going to break a taboo at Apple. Are we going to put macOS on iPads? Are we going to put iPadOS on Macs? I think we're going to see a strengthening of the Neo lineup pretty quickly. We've already seen that Apple apparently is abandoning the Mac Pro, the very high-end, truly professional model. They're going to refocus on the Studio and the Mini, which are doing really well. Are we going to get a new iMac? I hope so. I even think there's something really interesting to do with a Mac Neo and an iMac Neo. What could he do with the Vision Pro and Apple Glass? Well, that's the big topic right now. We're hearing a lot that Apple is going to abandon the Vision Pro. They are actually in the process of dismantling the team that brought the Vision Pro to market. I don't think John Ternus is going to abandon the Vision Pro. First, a little anecdote. John Ternus worked in VR before working at Apple, so it's a field he knows well. I've heard in a few videos that he didn't really push the Vision Pro project. But recently John Ternus stated that he believes in the Vision Pro, that he thinks it has a future. I think that, like most of us, he was really convinced by spatial computing. He knows that the Vision Pro is missing several things to be truly convincing. First, an affordable price. But then, Apple Intelligence that works, which would provide a much better interface. And above all, he's an engineer. He knows that a product like this is quite avant-garde and that it will take several iterations before it becomes truly accessible, has real uses, and is comfortable enough to become a mass-market product. So, in my opinion, the Vision Pro will keep moving forward. They might try to make a Vision Pro Lite or even a Vision Pro Neo to test the market a bit. But I don't think he's going to put all his energy into that. On the contrary, I think all the energy in VR AR will be focused on the Apple Glass. Why would Apple make Apple Glass? I made a whole video about this, but to sum it up, it's mainly because Apple can't leave room for the competition. Meta has proven that there's a real market. Google and Samsung are rushing into that opening. But above all, beyond that, those much discussed AR glasses, whether they have a display device or not, are a real demonstration of the usefulness of artificial intelligence as a hardware interface. And that's exactly the demonstration that John Ternus wants to make. Apple Intelligence that would use the resources of your iPhone pour la puissance qui transmettrait les données, for the power, which would transmit the data to a pair of glasses. Personally, for me, it's one of the products I'm most looking forward to from Apple. And regarding the iPhone, is he going to do something with the iPhones? The famous foldable iPhone, the iPhone Ultra, seems to be well underway. We could say that it's still more of a Tim Cook product than a John Ternus product. We'll see how it develops. What I mainly think is that John Ternus is going to push a lot for there to be Neo iPhones, which would somewhat take over from the iPhone one. But above all, as an engineer, he also knows that we're really witnessing the end of smartphones in a certain way. The smartphone has become a basic, almost boring purchase. There's little innovation left to be made in this field. It's more about the accessories, the ecosystem that we'll build around smartphones that's going to be interesting, so he'll have to promote other products. We know that health is a major focus. This was started by Tim Cook. It's an absolutely gigantic market. I think that AirPods, the Apple Watch of course, and maybe even Apple Glass will also be devices packed with health sensors. Will Apple launch a ring? I think there's something to be done, but above all, and this too is a recent statement from John Ternus. He's really focused on Apple services, and he's absolutely right. Hardware is great, it's his core area of expertise, but people buy hardware to use services. And services are really Apple's future treasure. The revenue from subscriptions is booming. The more an Apple user has iCloud subscriptions, Apple TV, and so on, the more they're in the Apple ecosystem and the harder it is to leave for something else. But everything I just did quickly as an analysis of Apple's future products, that's more about Apple's short-term products. What could be Apple's next one more thing? We could even make a game out of it. Will Tim Cook leave with one more thing? Will John Ternus start with a one more thing, but we can even wonder what the one more things of Apple's real future will be. I think what's really clear in John Ternus's mind is that Apple absolutely needs to reconnect with that reliability and its DNA, which is hardware plus software working together from the start. He also knows that Apple Intelligence, not a generative Apple Intelligence, but Apple Intelligence as an interface, is something essential for the future. An AI that would help control the hardware and would allow Apple to enter major fields like home automation and robotics. Apple is being very quiet for now. We don't see them with humanoid robots serving you cups of coffee or recharging washing machines. That doesn't mean they're not working on it. We've very discreetly seen projects like robotic arms and floor lamps. We also know that Apple is reportedly working on a kind of mobile iPad that would be in your home, sort of like a robotic presence. And I don't know about you, but for me, a little robot with an Apple logo. I wouldn't mind that. But once again, and this is where it must be very stressful for John Ternus, it all depends on whether Apple will succeed in this shift to Apple Intelligence, which once again goes far beyond generative artificial intelligence. In short, he has a lot on his plate. It's not an easy or enviable position. For starters, the weight of that legacy is enormous. On one hand, you'll have everyone saying the Steve Jobs era was better. Steve Jobs would never have allowed this. Steve Jobs would have done this, he would have done that. But now, you'll have people saying, well, during Tim Cook's era, we made a lot more money. And it's true that Tim Cook really set the bar very, very high financially. That standard will have to be maintained. And it's true that I didn't want to make a video about Tim Cook's legacy, but we still have to talk about his new position. Tim Cook isn't leaving Apple completely. Tim Cook announced that he will become the chairman of Apple, meaning he will effectively lead the board of directors. And his role will be a very political one. He will be there to reassure Wall Street, but especially to protect John Ternus, particularly on the political level. We've seen it in recent years. Tim Cook, rightly or wrongly, has started to appear a lot in American political life, a presence that's not so discreet. You can sense that Tim Cook is very, very afraid that the Trump administration will ostracize Apple and that he's ready to stoop very low to protect Apple. Tim Cook's strategy is kind of to create a protective shield around John Ternus so he can calmly continue working on Apple's future. Personally, I feel rather reassured by John Ternus's initial statements. I actually liked him during the keynotes. Indeed, someone quite discreet, but someone who seems to have a good head on his shoulders. Apple really is a fascinating company. Whether you love them or hate them, you can't help but be interested in what's happening at Apple, the CEO appointments. It's a bit like an episode of Game of Thrones. It wouldn't occur to me today to make an entire video about Samsung's organizational chart, for example. I think it could be interesting because there are things happening there, you know. So, I know what some people are going to say in the comments. You talk too much about Apple. It's not a company anymore, it's a cult. And you're not entirely wrong. But what I'm interested in is what you think of this analysis. Do you think John Ternus is the engineer who will save Apple? Assuming Apple is even in danger, but let's add a bit of drama, it gets more clicks. And if you found this interesting, subscribe to get our upcoming videos. We are indeed a channel that talks a lot about Apple, not only about Apple, but still a lot about Apple. And by the way, if you want to keep watching, check out the video where I was wondering if artificial intelligence is really in Apple's DNA. And with that, I'll see you very, very soon for another video.